Hi, it's Rory from counsellingtutor.com and I'm with
Bob Cooke from the Manchester Institute for Psychotherapy.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hi Bob. I'm in my hometown of Manchester again, talking to Bob and talking about object relations. I know a few of you on the channel have asked me to do a video about object relations, so I've come to see Bob Cooke today, who's incredibly knowledgeable about psychodynamic theory, and we're going to talk and discuss object relations. So Bob,
Hello.
what is object relations?
That's a good question, as it's a particularly obscure word, I often think.
Right.
It was first used in the psychotherapy literature by the godfather of modern day psychotherapy, which of course is Sigmund Freud.
Sigmund Freud. You don't have to look too deeply before he comes up deep off.
And when he termed the word object, he was talking about not only the significant other, that would be the mother, the father, the grandfather, the brother, the sister in the client's family, but it's actually talking about the inanimate objects like a bus or a dog or a cat. The object could be any other.
Right.
Right. In Freud's terminology.
Okay.
As the psychological literature developed, and today we've got object relations therapy, Sheldon Cashdan, who wrote probably the most prominent book on object relations theory stroke therapy, came out with a book in 1990 where he talked about object relations therapy, where the object is referred to as a significant other. Yeah, that's different from Freud's version of object.
So there's been a movement from Freud's ideas where it could be absolutely anything,
yeah,
to it being more precise and being maybe a caregiver or a significant individual in somebody's life.
Correct. And that's usually the term that we use when we talk about object relations therapy. So what happens is, in the development of the psyche, the child internalizes the other, which is the object.
Right.
So the mother, the father, the sibling, etc.
Right.
So if we look at the development of the child, and let's look at psychodynamic development.
Okay, so this is psychodynamic theory. This is really in the remit of the psychodynamic.
Yeah, Margaret Mahler.
Right.
Okay. Now she talked about one of the most important parts of child development is the time between 1.5 and 3.5, which she called individuation separation period. 1.5 to 3.5.
Okay, and that period would be where the child is becoming autonomous, maybe?
Correct.
Starting to find their own life and their own experience.
Yeah, and the major goal in the completion of this period is what Mahler called object constancy.
Right. Now, I've done a little bit of study on this before I came today, which is always a dangerous thing, a little knowledge. But object constancy, I'm getting as consistent attention or caregiving.
Correct.
Yes, from the caregiver.
Yeah. So you've internalized the constant mother. So Margaret Mahler split up the individuation separation period into periods of what is called infant practicing. So in the search for individuation or object constancy, the infant would practice throughout this time the movement away from the self in search of autonomy, yeah, and then at the same time is internalizing the object at a constant level. So that, in other words, the mother or the caretaker is always there in the psychological makeup of the infant, not only in constant, day, but also in terms of stress. So under stress, they have a constant internalized other in their head.
Okay, so it sounds to me, I know we talked off camera earlier about the Jiminy Cricket character, this notion that as the child's separating, they carry with them a Jiminy Cricket character. If you watch Jiminy Cricket, he sits on the shoulder of Pinocchio, telling him the right thing, soothing and giving sound advice, and this sounds like the object you're talking about. It sounds like this is the caregiver. So when the child is under stress, then they revert back to that caregiver.
Yeah.
It's almost like a mechanism of soothing.
Correct, a good enough other.
A good enough other.
And Winnicott's term for this is a good enough mother.
Right.
Now, of course, you'll internalise as well the father, the parent, the siblings, the immediate family. In object relations therapy, it's that family that we're referring to.
Right. So when we're looking at specific therapy, object relations therapy, which is a specific type of psychoanalytical therapy, that the work would be about helping the client to identify initially what that caregiver was?
Yes, and certainly in transaction analysis psychotherapy, which is a derivative of psychodynamic therapy, there would certainly be the emphasis on the client understanding those dialogues, the consistent object,
yes,
and also the negative other, or the negative objects that they may have internalised at the same time.
Okay.
Because the problem comes, of course, is not with the internalisation of the good enough object, but of course if there's a break in the attachment process there, if there's a loss, if the object, if you like, is unhealthy in terms of if they're an abuser,
yes,
or if they shame the person, or if they humiliate
sure,
the infant. So the object constancy has to happen,
yes,
part of psychological development. However, if the object is, in inverted commas, unhealthy or abusive, then you will internalise that object.
yes. So so if you've got a very abusive caregiver, when you're stressed out or you're in a position where you need soothing, instead of the soothing, you will be giving yourself those negative ideas from your past.
Correct. And that makes up predictability, consistency, stability in terms of identity forming.
So this is about the formation of personality and how we are in the world.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the early objects that make up that personality.
Sure. So if you've got a healthy object relation, it's interesting, isn't it? The psychology she talks about mother, but I guess, am I right in thinking that would be any caregiver?
Correct.
Right. But he was probably a man of his time and chose the mother figure.
Correct.
It could be any significant caregiver.
Yeah, Cashdan talks a lot about that.
Right. So if there's a positive caregiver, and as someone gets older and they get stressed, they're more likely to be able to self-manage, self-soothe, and find a balance in their life.
Correct.
By drawing up this historical object, this historical caregiver, that's like a Jiminy Cricket figure.
Correct.
What happens when the opposite happens, when the caregiver is a negative force, and when the person's stressed, they're pulling this negative force in? What's liable to happen to an individual?
Well, the opposite of the healthy object.
Yes.
In other words, you will have a negative object. There'll be negative words. There'll be a negative sense of self-image. There'll be a negative sense of self.
Yes.
And your self-esteem will be low, and there'll be more what we call unhealth or pathology.
Yes. And I think, I don't know if you see this in your practice, but I've had it in my practice where clients have said to me, when they've done something wrong, they bring in that significant other from their past, almost like a club wielder, to beat them up a bit more.
Correct.
To say, I was told by my father, my mother, or my partner, but maybe we're looking at more historical stuff than that with object relations, and they almost seem to make an ally of this person to give themselves a difficult time.
Correct.
So what's the therapist's role in this?
Well, now we come to really the, and we can't really talk about object relations without talking about this phenomena.
Right.
Okay. Now we're really talking about the concept of transference.
Yes.
Now, this becomes very important when we talk about object relations. Yeah. So, by the mechanism of transference, and that is the transferring over the image, feelings, behaviour onto the other. That's the therapist.
Right. Presenting past.
The presenting past, yeah.
Yes.
That's the phenomenon of transference. Through the mechanism of transference, the person can internalise the good object of the therapist.
Right.
Yeah, which will provide protection, idealisation, stability, consistency, close proximity to mediate, if you like, between the good and bad objects.
Yes.
So that the client can achieve some sense of stability, consistency and empowerment. So
it very much sounds like the therapist is another Jiminy Cricket character who comes along and for want of a better word.
Yeah, I quite like that.
Yeah, and mediates between this historic object that may be giving the client a bad time, and steps in between them almost like a referee.
Correct.
But isn't there something about the fact that the therapist is giving positive attribution to the client?
Yeah. There's a couple of things here. Eric Byrne, who is the founder of Transactional Analysis Psychotherapy, coined a term which he called Interposition Psychotherapy, where exactly what you just talked about occurs, that the client, through the mechanism of transference, internalises the psychotherapist as the good object that will mediate between the internalised healthy and unhealthy objects of the client. And in that mediation may well give permissions to the client to be able to, if you like, find a voice in the conflict between the negative and healthy objects.
Yes. Be able to, there's a wonderful quote by Rogers who talks about the client being trapped in a prison, wanting to be heard, knocking on the prison walls. In a metaphorical sense, not literally in prison. And it sounds to me like the therapist is helping the client get a voice and be who they want to be, develop themselves.
Yeah, and Cohert, who is one of the most foremost psychoanalysts, who broke away from Freud in the early 1950s, and was around at the time of Rogers, and formed what was called the self-psychology movement in the United States, coined 3 transferences: idealizing transference, the merging transference, and the mirroring transference. And through those particular transferences, then it's the same again. The client internalises the therapist, and the protection mechanism through idealisation, the mirroring of the good attributes of the therapist, all help the client to develop a more robust sense of self through the mechanism of transference.
Oh, that's incredible, that, isn't it? And a lot of transference is subconscious, isn't it?
Really in the realms of unconscious. I mean, Freud, way back in his first book on hysteria, when he started to develop the ideas of transference and the use of transference to help this internalized process in terms of object relations that we're talking about, went as far to say the psychoanalysis in terms of a curative effect won't happen without transference.
Oh. So then there needs to be, in this particular model, the notion that at some level the therapist is internalised to the clients.
Correct. Otherwise, as Eric Byrne said, speaking 60 years later in his model, you will simply be having an adult-to-adult chat. No cure will happen.
Ah. So it has to be more than just a chat. It has to be. So what kind of attributes does the therapist need to show to develop this significant other object?
Stability. That means always being there for the client.
Yes.
Consistency. In other words, in terms of mood swings, that they actually are providing a nurturative support.
Sure.
Permissions, that they are giving healthily permissions to the client, and modelling a healthy enough other.
Yes. So all the kind of things that therapists should be doing. And that's the key thing here. Should be doing. Of maybe in terms of consistency, turn up on time, turn up prepared for the session. In terms of giving permission, allowing the client space to explore the material.
Correct.
Yes.
And of course, again, Coed came up with the discovery of what he called empathy, a quality which he said that all good, in inverted commas, I don't know what he meant by good, anyway, psychoanalysts needed to develop the ability to get into the skin of the client.
Yes.
In the service of attunement.
Yes.
And that will help develop the mechanism of transference.
Yes.
See, it's all going back to this development of transference through basically the unconscious mode, really.
So it's interesting you talk about therapeutic attunement. Sometimes when I'm teaching, I talk about internal frames of references. I don't think they're too far apart.
No.
I don't think they're too far apart. So we've got to the stage where the client's in therapy, the therapist is providing this other object.
Yes.
Oh, what happens when the therapy comes to an end? How do both the parties know that this new object, this new Jiminy Cricket character, is established well enough to work post the therapeutic engagement? So at what point does the therapy finish?
Well, let's use Eric Byrne's language of transaction analysis to give some clues into the answer here, or at least the response here. Now, he would say when the client has developed a robust enough sense of adult over time, so that under stress they can organise and regulate their emotions so they can stay in the here and now.
Yes.
Right?
So they're not catapulted back to the past.
That's right.
And that negative object, and hearing that negative object speaking to them as they may be as small children, but they can work with here and now responses.
Right.
And I guess in TA theory, access their adult ego states.
Correct. Yeah. And Cashdan, speaking about object relations therapy, or Kernberg, talking about psychoanalytical borderline theory, would talk about the integration of the negative and positive objects, so that the person can mediate between the two and develop their robustness of self.
Okay, so know the difference between that negative voice and
Yes.
positive voice, and be able to, in their own ways, say actually that is the past, the here and now is completely different.
Correct. And in that has developed the ability of spontaneity and the freedom of action in the present, instead of being stuck in some archaic child ego state.
Yeah, so it's a bit like the time machine, isn't it? In a way, they're kind of in the time machine, you know, stuck in the past with the feelings and thoughts and behaviours of the past, and then the therapist sort of helps them to kind of come to the here and now, into the present time, and regulate themselves and be able to have that internal dialogue. Yeah,
absolutely.
Well, I thought that was really fascinating. I've learned so much. It's not a subject, I have to be honest, to say that I know a lot about, and I'm just so grateful for spending this time with you, Bob. I've learned so much, and I'm sure the people who are going to watch are going to learn equally as much. So, Bob Cooke, thank you.
Thank you.
And as always, to you out there, thank you for watching.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.